Hello and welcome to today's program. My name is Lauren Cornegay-Dollar and I am the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. Today we are joined by Leslie Schover, as she is an author, and we're very excited to hear all about her book and the story within. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to the museum and the Nimitz Foundation for giving me this opportunity. Today I'm going to talk about my parents and the Manhattan Project and how I turned their family tales into a historical novel. And I'm going to start with a little introductory video to give you a picture.
My parents, Don and Janet, eloped in 1941, a few weeks before Pearl Harbor. Janet had graduated high school at age 16 and wanted to be a concert pianist or a lawyer. Don had a year of electronics technical training. 8 months after the marriage, my sister was born prematurely, and my mother had to drop out of the University of Chicago. My father was recruited by Dr. Charles Coriel to work on the Manhattan Project. He told Don and Janet about the atomic bomb. My father moved to the secret city of Oak Ridge with the Coriel Group in September 1943. My mother and sister followed within several months. My father worked in X-10, the nuclear reactor complex. He may have known 2 men later identified as Soviet spies, Oscar Sabourin and George Koval. Like Don, both were electronics experts from immigrant Jewish families. My novel Fission includes many of my parents' Oak Ridge stories, as well as fictional characters and plot elements.
So let me tell you a little bit about my career before I wrote Fission. I was born in 1952 after my parents returned to Chicago. So it was my older sister who was born in 1942. And I spent most of my career as a clinical psychologist, and I specialized in reproductive health in people with chronic illness, especially cancer, and retired from my academic job at MD Anderson Cancer Center in 2016. I also published a textbook and some self-help books and had my own digital health company for a few years. Then when I truly retired, I had time to return to my early love of writing fiction. The Manhattan Project did have some influence on my life. I remember at around age 10, my father went to White Sands, New Mexico on a business trip and brought home some trinitite, the fused green glass from the atomic bomb test at the Trinity site. And I also vividly remember watching President Kennedy relate the Cuban Missile Crisis when I was age 10 and asking my father why we weren't building a bomb shelter in our suburban backyard, and his telling me, honey, it wouldn't help, which devastated me. At age 17, I watched the finally declassified film of the aftermath of the atomic bombings, the injuries in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with my father at my side. And I turned and asked him, Dad, how did you feel working on this? And he said, well, you have to remember that we thought the Nazis were working towards an atomic bomb, and our first goal was to get it first. My father lived to be 87, and near the end of his life, he took a lot of pride in his work in the Manhattan Project and gave talks to senior citizens groups. I decided to write this novel partly out of my interest, of course, in preventing nuclear proliferation and reducing the risk of nuclear war. I also wanted to understand what my mother's life was like as a young woman, as we'll see, long before I was born. And I wanted to corroborate some of my parents' rather crazy stories about what life was like in Oak Ridge. And then my curiosity was piqued by 2 revelations about atomic spies in Oak Ridge. In 2019, the New York Times reported about Oscar Sabourin, who was a special engineer detachment engineer. These were young men with technical smarts and training that the Army recruited and distributed to the Manhattan Project sites. So he was in Oak Ridge and then Los Alamos, but was only identified as a spy many years later when the Venona Project decoded Soviet cables. Then in 2021, the author Anne Hagedorn wrote the nonfiction book Sleeper Agent about the second Oak Ridge spy, George Koval, who was also in the engineer detachment. Like my dad, both of these men worked in the X-10 nuclear reactor building, were electronics engineers, and there weren't that many on the project, and came from first-generation Jewish immigrant families. So I wonder very much if he knew them, but I'll never know. Unlike my father, both were communists and returned after the war to the Soviet Union, so they were never caught or prosecuted. And in fact, Koval got a posthumous medal from Putin in 2007 for his work in Dayton, giving them the secret of the trigger to the plutonium bomb. Why did they spy for the Soviets? Well, both the Seaborer and Koval families believed strongly in communism. As Eastern European Jews, they encountered anti-Semitism both in the US and in Stalin's Soviet Union. So I don't know that they ever felt at home anywhere. And both families ping-ponged back and forth between the two countries. Also, during World War II, a lot of people longed for a united world government. In fact, many scientists in the Manhattan Project did not want atomic power to be a monopoly for the United States, but hoped it would be regulated by a world government. And of course, the Soviet Union was officially our ally, although by the time Germany surrendered and the bomb was ready to be used, it became a tool to limit Soviet aspirations to control parts of Asia and Europe. But the espionage, not only of these two relatively minor spies, but of several others, allowed the Soviets to build and test a copy of our plutonium bomb in 1949, a lot earlier than was thought they would get it. To tell you a little about my parents, my mother was born in 1922 to a first-generation Eastern European immigrant family. Her father retouched catalogs for a living. She graduated high school at 16 and wanted to be a concert pianist or a lawyer. She was a woman before her time. She had one wealthy uncle who offered to send her to Wellesley, but she was too scared to go that far away from home at that age. So instead, she went to the University of Chicago and lived at home, where she was introduced by friends to my father, who was born in 1919 to a more immigrant working class family. His parents owned a series of failed candy and liquor stores. Although my dad had unusual math ability, it was not really recognized when he was in school. And by the time he met my mother, he had had a year of technical training in electronics, and he was working a wartime job at Jensen Speakers, designing loudspeakers for battleships. So they met and married in October 1941, when my mother was only 19, and she went to a quack gynecologist who told her she was infertile, so they stopped using protection. She immediately got pregnant and had to drop out of college with just a year to go. When my father was sent to Oak Ridge, she followed him, leaving my sister with her parents as a toddler till their house was ready and she could return from Chicago to bring my sister, whose name was Michael, to Oak Ridge. In early 1943, while they were still in Chicago, Charles Coriel invited both my parents to dinner at his house. He told them that the chemistry group needed an electronics instrumentation expert. And although my dad was young and very junior, he had some of the skills they needed. Somehow that evening, he ended up telling both of them that his group was working towards an atomic bomb and to produce the first gram of plutonium. I was very curious because, as we know, most people on the Manhattan Project had no idea what they were working on, and my parents were awfully junior, plus my mother wasn't involved at all except as a wife. So in 2023, when I started writing the book, I looked up Charles Corriell online and discovered that his daughter, Julie, who is a year younger than my older sister, had published a very extensive book of interviews done by Columbia University about his career. I emailed her, and we've become dear friends over the last couple of years. However, neither of us know why Corriell informed my parents of so much classified information or how he vetted them ahead of time. We know he believed in Quaker democracy, that his group should have knowledge as needed. And certainly by the time they were in Oak Ridge, it's clear from the oral histories that men in his group knew what they were working on. I think my father may have been reluctant to leave his wartime job, and maybe he needed convincing that this was more important. But my family story was that when they got home that night, my mother asked, "Are you going to take the job?" And my father answered, "Honey, I don't think I have a choice." And they told that story many times. There were some early Oak Ridge experiences that give you the flavor of what it was like. When my mother was ready to take the train from Chicago to Oak Ridge, she had to let my father know when she was arriving. And it took all day and 4 long-distance operators to reach him because everyone kept saying there was no such place as Oak Ridge. When she got there, they threw them a welcome party at the guest house and gave them a one-night pass. The guest house was the only hotel in early Oak Ridge, and Oak Ridge was dry. The only alcohol allowed, because it was run by the Army, was near beer. But my father was popular because he was in charge of the lab alcohol, and it was not the poisonous kind. So they had many creative punch recipes. So everyone sat in the lobby and drank punch, while the married couples took turns using my parents' hotel room because everyone was still living in sex-segregated dorms, and there were no conjugal visits. Then my mother had to learn how to shop at the grocery store. She came in and asked, put 6 Cokes on the counter, and the clerk said, "Ma'am, I can't give you those Cokes without empties." And she said, "But I don't have any empties. I just got here." And he said, "I'll turn my back." And she didn't know what he was getting at. So he turned around and pointed to some empty bottles on another shelf. And he said, "I'll turn my back." So she took 6 empty bottles, put them on the counter, and said, "Sir, here are my empties." And then he said, "Okay, ma'am, you want them in a poke?" And she had no idea that a poke was a brown paper bag. Then she took my sister all over Oak Ridge in this fancy English pram that was a gift from that one wealthy uncle. And it was lucky they had it because Oak Ridge was a sea of mud and the only sidewalks were wooden boardwalks. So that's how she got around to do errands. And one day it was winter and she left my sister in the pram outside a store for a couple of minutes while she nipped in to do something, came back out, and my sister and the pram were gone. It took several minutes to figure out that a bank guard thought she looked cold and had taken her inside the bank. So all these stories were great for the novel. Now, the Corriell group made a number of contributions to the Manhattan Project. The first gram of plutonium was actually produced in Chicago before they went to Oak Ridge at the Met Lab, but they were the Fission Products Lab, and as we'll see, they produced large quantities of radioactive isotopes, especially one called barium-140. And towards the end of the war, Corriell, along with Marinsky and Glendenin, discovered a new element, promethium, which was named by Julie's mother, who said, "You have stolen fire from the gods." Barium Day, September 18th, 1944, was the day they shipped the largest shipment of barium to Los Alamos. Oppenheimer had called Charles needing a radioactive isotope to test the lenses for the implosion trigger of the plutonium bomb. Now, that was a ball of plutonium, and to explode it, they had a series of precision lenses that surrounded it that had to be imploded in a very precise manner. And they needed a radioactive isotope to test that process. In the real trigger, they used polonium, which was produced in Dayton. But Charles proposed to test it using barium-140, which is somewhat radioactive, but has a very short half-life. And it would decay within a couple of days to a very reactive compound, lanthanum-140. And during those days, it was trucked under armed guard from Oak Ridge to Los Alamos in large lead chests. And in Los Alamos, they called it Rala. The first small shipment they got, they spilled because it was in glass tubing, and they had to take the floor of the lab and bury it in a canyon. That's how radioactive it was. I wanted to show you a video of my dad recounting his accidental exposure to radiation. It's only 3 minutes long, and I love watching it because he's been dead since 2007, and I love hearing his voice again.
We were all in danger of being exposed to radiation, gamma rays, beta, etc. So there was a group called Health Physics that kept us safe. So we all wore 2 little fountain pen gauges with little ion chambers that got charged up in the morning, and then they read at the end of the day how much charge had leaked off, and that would measure how much radiation you'd received. They had 2 of them in case one of them just was leaky. If the 2 readings didn't agree, then they'd know it wasn't real. And then we also wore what people still wear when they're working with x-rays, a film badge that was read once a week. Both of your pocket chambers are totally discharged. Please tell us what kind of samples you're handling, how you're handling them, and how are you going to correct the situation. So I immediately called them, told them I'm running the counting lab, and I said all of my background counts are normal. This room is not contaminated, and I don't allow hot samples in here for danger that it would ruin all of them. We'd have to thoroughly clean out everything if it got loose in here. So they said, well, we'll check on you tomorrow. The next day they called me up and they said, well, both of your pocket chambers are totally discharged again. And I said, you better come down here and look. So they came down with little portable, we call them cutie pies, little ion chambers or Geiger tubes. There were 2 types depending on how hot the sample was. And as they got near my desk, which was up against a wall, the needle started going up and up and up. And I don't know, for 2 or 3 days I had been sitting in a chair being shined on by gamma rays. And they said, you better look at what's going on next door. And next door, they had a very hot sample, and they had carefully built a shield around it of lead bricks, all 3 sides and the top. They had neglected to put any in the back. So it was shining through the wall. But I had another child after that with 1 head. And it didn't show up on me. When I came home from Oak Ridge, I went to my doctor, my family doctor, and he was sure I had radiation poisoning because I had very low blood count. And I said, honest to God, I said it wasn't radiation, it was the food.
So radiation safety was still at a somewhat primitive level. And The Coriell group hated those radiation safety meetings, and they tried to be proactive. For example, Charles Coriell got the Army to build him a special hot lab to work with these samples. But Larry Glendenin, the very eminent chemist who discovered promethium, violated the rules by putting his mouth on a pipette with a radioactive isotope inside and got a mouthful of isotope. And to punish him and be a warning, they made him wash out his mouth in public for about an hour. And that was how he met his wife. She was working in the building and she came by to see his humiliation. But ever after, they called that isotope the Glendenin cocktail. Later on, they also, one month, the radiation safety people came to Glendenin and said, "You've got the cleanest radiation badge. Would you please give a little lecture to your colleagues on your radiation safety techniques?" So he said, got it in front of everyone and said, "Well, every morning I put on my lab coat. I clip my 2 badges to my lab coat. I go to the door of my lab. I put my lab coat on the coat tree and go into my lab and do my work." And of course, everyone laughed except for the radiation safety guys. My dad was also very proud of being a signer of the Szilard petition. This was a petition to Truman asking him not to use the atomic bomb on Japan without demonstrating its power first and giving Japan a chance to surrender. However, Truman never saw it, probably because General Groves made it top secret and deep-sixed it. It was started and drafted by the physicist Szilard at the Chicago Met Lab. And in Oak Ridge, there were 67 signers, including Coriell and my father. But it was not allowed to be circulated by Oppenheimer in Los Alamos, who was very tight with Groves. Also, the Army engineers in Oak Ridge were not allowed by Charles to sign it because he was afraid they might get court-martialed. And this is a copy of the petition, and you can see up here Coriell's signature and my dad's signature. He said he was probably the only person without a college degree who signed it. So a novel also needs drama. So I took these stories, but I also made Fission the story of Doris Friedman's coming of age. And Doris is the surrogate character for my mother. And she has a fictional female friendship with Betty, who is a Richmond debutante who originally believes that all Jews have horns. And that was a story my mother told me, that one of the Southern women thought she ought to have horns. There's also a fictional love triangle. So when Rob, the husband, is exposed to radiation, Doris meets a special engineer, Dave Sokol, who becomes her piano student and tries to seduce her to get her husband's instrumentation circuit diagrams. How do we reconcile the good and evil that came out of the Manhattan Project? Well, obviously, we needed to defeat fascism in the form of the Nazis in Japan, and there was the fear until after Germany's surrender and some reconnaissance missions that Germany was working towards an atomic bomb. There was the difficulty of getting the Japanese to surrender, despite the fact that their defeat looked inevitable. There was also the incredible science and industrial leadership. So Oak Ridge started out as a rural area with 3,000 people, and in 3 years became a small city of 75,000 with the biggest building in the United States, the uranium separation plant. There was atomic energy for power and research that came out of it, and the development of radiation medicine, both for imaging and for radiation therapy. Obviously, the evil is introducing a weapon that could end all human life on Earth, the horrible suffering at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the radiation contamination and health risks and deaths associated with Oak Ridge, Hanford, Washington, the Trinity testing site, and from atmospheric atomic testing. So there's no easy answers. But I hope you will take a look at Fission. And I do have an author website that has a lot more information. And even more than that, if you like Substack, I have a Substack nuclear fiction newsletter that talks about a lot of my family stories and how they influenced the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for sharing this story with us. I have a couple of questions for you as we get into our Q&A. And the first one I want to lead with is, how long did it take you to complete this project, to go from the idea of the novel all the way to publication?
I think it took about a year and a half to start writing it and get it accepted for publication. Then I used a hybrid publisher, which is a little faster than a traditional publisher, but it was still about a year and a half. So about a 3-year journey from starting to write it till it was actually published this January.
Did your father suffer any long-term issues from radiation exposure?
No, thank goodness he did not. He lived to be 87, and the only cancer he had was a tiny spot of prostate cancer that was found by accident, which is true of most men in that age group. So he did have, when he initially was exposed to the radiation, my dad was 6'3", and my mother always said he went down to 140 pounds, and he also had strep throat. So I don't know if those were radiation side effects or not, but luckily he had no long-term effects. However, Julie's father, Charles Coriel, died when he was, I believe, only 56, and he did die of a rare sarcoma that is pretty likely to have been radiation triggered. And a number of other people who worked on the project also died of cancer.
You mentioned that the city just kind of erupted overnight. It went from 0 to several thousand very quickly. Can you speak about the housing and what it was like for your mom and your sister?
Well, once their house was ready, which took a few months, they were building so many houses. They built them out of something called cemesto, which were panels made of cement and asbestos. And they were called alphabet houses because the A houses only had 1 bedroom, the Bs had 2 bedrooms, the Cs had 3 bedrooms, etc. So my parents had a B cemesto, and believe it or not, those houses are still used in Oak Ridge today. And I went to Oak Ridge last October and took a picture of my parents' house and Julie's parents' house. They're both still there and more or less in their original form. And they say if you don't disturb the cemesto, the asbestos isn't dangerous. I hope so. But there was a lot of housing shortage. A lot of people lived in barracks and dorms or in smaller houses. And the thing that was really very unfortunate was the way African Americans were treated in Oak Ridge. The Jim Crow laws were in force, and they had to live in what they called hutments. And the Children's Museum has a reconstruction of one. They're literally made of plywood, and they had no window panes. They had a central coal furnace. And you can imagine in the hideously hot summers and cold winters in Oak Ridge how miserable it was. And 4 people lived in a hutment. So, and there were also trailers that people lived in. So it was very cobbled together. Oak Ridge today only has a population of 35,000 and is still a very research-oriented city with a lot of new nuclear reactor startups and stuff going on.
My next question is, are there any little tidbits of information from your mom that she would talk about, just like funny things that happened on the daily or things that like she experienced there that she never experienced the rest of her life?
Well, other than the stories I told, one that I put in the book is that one morning a colonel called her and asked her to come with him to Knoxville to pick out a piano for the officers' recreation hall. And on the way, there was still road construction, and he instructed the driver, drive on, and they got stuck in the unconstructed road and had to be pulled out by construction equipment. And when they got to Knoxville, the colonel managed to get some bootleg liquor to take back into Oak Ridge. You had to enter Oak Ridge through gates, and the guards would inspect all the cars for liquor and confiscate it and probably drink it or sell it back to the liquor stores. So he managed to get through without his car, of course, being inspected. So my mother chuckled a lot about that. I wish that I had asked my mother, I never thought to ask her, what it was like to have that secret of knowing about the atomic bomb when hardly any of the other wives knew.
Now, I have a question for you based on like your thoughts and what you might think your parents would have thought of the Oppenheimer movie.
I did see the Oppenheimer movie, and I thought it gave a pretty realistic idea of daily life during the Manhattan Project. I enjoyed it very much, and I think it gave a pretty nuanced interpretation of what Oppenheimer was like. My parents never talked about Oppenheimer much, but I know they really didn't like Edward Teller. And I'm not sure if that was because of his advocacy for the hydrogen bomb, or if it was because of the way he testified against Oppenheimer. But my parents were always on the more liberal end of the spectrum politically.
So, Leslie, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but I did do a little bit of digging to see what kind of artifacts we have in our collection here at the National Museum of the Pacific War in relation to your story. And we do have a piece that is currently on display. It is a toolbox from Alamogordo, and that is on display in our current galleries over where you'll find the information about the atomic bomb and our Fat Man casing. We do have another artifact as well that is currently not on display, but it is a copy of the August 9th, 1945 Oak Ridge, Tennessee newspaper entitled Oak Ridge Journal, with the headline announcing the use of a locally developed atomic bomb at Hiroshima. I want to say thank you, Leslie, for being here with us and sharing the story of your parents and your novel. I found it very interesting to get a perspective from your parents and their experiences. And to our at-home audience, I want to say thank you for joining us again. And from all of us here at the National Museum of the Pacific War, we'll see you next time.